I used to think love could survive distance, silence, even neglect. I thought if you stayed long enough, if you endured long enough, the bond you once had would eventually resurface. My name is Claire. I'm 35, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my marriage crumbled in front of an entire room of people and how betrayal pushed me down a path of revenge I never imagined I'd take. My husband Mark and I had been married for almost a decade. Somewhere along the way, though, we stopped being partners. We didn't scream or fight every day, but we also didn't talk. We existed like roommates, not lovers. He buried himself in work, endless meetings, late nights at the office, while I buried myself in keeping the house together, trying to ignore the growing emptiness between us. Mark thrived in the corporate world. He was outgoing, ambitious, always surrounded by colleagues. I was the opposite. Quiet, introverted content with my own company. Social events drained me, and I avoided them whenever I could. But when he brought up his company's annual party, he didn't just suggest I go. He insisted. He said it would be good for me, that it was time I met the people he spent so much of his life with. For the first time in years, it felt like he wanted me in his world again. And against my instincts, I let that flicker of hope convince me. I wore a simple but elegant dress, one I thought he would notice. He looked sharp in his tailored suit, but he didn't compliment me, not even once. Still, I told myself it was fine. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe this night really could be a chance for us to reconnect. The party was exactly what I expected, grand, glittering, full of people who thrived on power and status. I smiled, shook hands, listened to conversations about mergers and profits I didn't care about, and to my surprise, I managed. I even caught Mark glancing at me a few times, almost proud, like maybe I belonged there after all. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we were finding our way back to each other. But then the music changed. Lights dimmed and couples moved to the dance floor. That's when he appeared, one of Mark's colleagues, a man named Richard. He didn't even look at me at first. He looked straight at Mark, then at me, and extended his hand as if the outcome was already decided. "Dance with me," he said. I froze, waiting for Mark to step in, to put his arm around me, to tell him I was his wife. But Mark said nothing. Worse, he smiled, almost amused, as if he was curious what I would do. My heart raced, and before I could find the words, Richard leaned closer, confident, certain. And then I did the unthinkable. I let him lead me to the dance floor. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even what I wanted. But in that moment, I was desperate for something, for attention, for acknowledgement, for proof that I still existed. Richard held me too close, his hand pressing into the small of my back, his eyes lingering in ways that made my skin crawl. But what hurt most wasn't his touch. It was Mark's face in the crowd, watching unbothered, as if I were nothing more than entertainment. When the song ended, Richard whispered something in my ear, something smug and degrading. I pulled away, humiliated, and hurried back to the table. Mark barely looked up. He took a sip of his drink and said, "You embarrassed yourself." That night in the car, I tried to explain. I told him I felt abandoned, that he should have stopped it, that he should have claimed me as his wife. He cut me off. He told me I was paranoid, insecure, dramatic. He turned everything upside down until I felt like the villain in my own story. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had stopped respecting me long before that night, and the way he let Richard handle me like I was free for the taking was proof. Our marriage wasn't broken, it was already dead. What Mark didn't know, though, was that I wasn't going to let the humiliation end there. He thought I'd swallow it like I always did. He thought I'd stay silent, invisible. But that night, something inside me hardened. If he was going to betray me with his indifference, and if Richard was going to disrespect me so boldly, then both of them were going to learn who I really was. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling while the city hummed outside our window, replaying the way Richard's hand had branded my back and the way Mark had watched like a spectator at a show. By morning, the humiliation had cooled into something steadier and far more dangerous. I made coffee, washed one mug, and set it carefully in the rack, as if neatness could keep the rest of my life from spilling. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote a single line: "I won't be erased." It looked small on the page, but it felt like the first sentence of a new chapter 1, where I protected myself the way I had once protected us. Revenge did not start with fireworks. It started with information. I knew Richard's name, his title, the department he ran. I had heard snippets of whispered gossip at the party about his charisma, the way certain interns clung to him like ivy. People like Richard are careful when the lights are bright and careless when they think you've looked away. I spent a week gathering details the way rain gathers along a gutter quietly drop by drop. I scrolled through public photos, read articles, noted which charity boards he loved to flaunt, which bars he and the team frequented after late meetings. I wasn't looking to smear a stranger for sport. I was mapping the field so I could walk across it without stepping on a mine. At home, Mark pretended normal had returned. He left early, came home late, and met my soft questions with a wall of indifference. When I brought up the party, his mouth tightened into a smile that wasn't a smile. "We should move on," he said. I stared at him across the dinner table and felt the ache of knowing that we had become a word he used to keep me docile, a rope he tossed into the silence and expected me to hold. I didn't tell him that. While he spoke, I was remembering the way Richard's eyes had slid past Mark to settle on me, as if he were testing the perimeter of our marriage in plain sight. I didn't tell him about the message I'd received 2 days after the party from a junior analyst, just a sentence and a trembling heart emoji. "If you need someone to talk to about Richard, I'm here." I didn't know her, but I knew that tone. It was the sound of a woman trying to warn another without burning herself. We met for tea in a cafe across town where no one from the office went. She was young, maybe 24, with hands that couldn't stop worrying the paper sleeve of her cup. She told me haltingly at first, then with the relief of a flood about mentorship dinners that turned into cornered hands, how gifts appeared on her desk with a weight she couldn't refuse, how HR had taken her complaint and gently filed it into the abyss. "He's careful," she said, eyes flicking to the door. "He doesn't write what he can say. He doesn't touch where cameras see." "But everyone knows." She swallowed hard. "We know. Everyone knows." I walked home feeling like I'd been handed a stone with a name carved into it. Richard wasn't just a man who had disrespected me, he was a man who had practiced erasing women for years and taught a company how to look away while he did it. The fury I felt wasn't clean. It was laced with shame, shame that I had let him touch me, shame that I had wanted my husband to stop him, shame that I was standing on a sidewalk wondering when exactly I had stopped defending myself. I started collecting stories, not gossip documents. I helped the analyst put her experience in writing dates and times and witnesses. She introduced me to a project manager who left for personal reasons after a performance review turned into a proposition. I watched them speak and saw myself reflected in the tremor at the edge of their voices, the part of us that asks if we are to blame for what happened to us. I kept their names safe. I scanned what they gave me into a password-protected archive and stored copies in a place Mark would never think to check. I called a woman I knew from a legal clinic. I once volunteered, at discreet, meticulous, a quiet blade, disguised as a pen, and asked her what it takes to be heard when a company pretends it can't hear. She told me patterns, corroboration proof of retaliation. She told me where to send it so it could not be quietly unsent. All the while I watched Mark. At first I thought he was innocent of anything but apathy. But apathy is a kind of choice, and choices leave trails. Late one night, he came home smelling of the same whiskey I'd seen at the party, the same brand Richard boasted about. He tossed his suit jacket onto a chair carelessly, and as I picked it up, an embossed card slid from the pocket, an invitation to a team advancement retreat, a weekend in the same coastal city I had noted on Richard's calendar weeks before. There was a time when I would have asked to come. That time had passed. Instead, I slipped the card back and took its meaning with me like a weather report, a storm scheduled for Saturday. If this story were only about a leering coworker and a distant husband, it would be easy to say I was justified in what I did next. But families complicate clean lines. 2 days before the retreat, Mark's mother called me. She never called. Her voice was careful, as if she were placing porcelain onto a shelf that might not hold. "He's not his father," she said abruptly, without hello, and I realized we were not speaking about calendars. But he learned from him. How to pretend he doesn't see what he sees. How to let other men do what he won't, and then call it none of his business. I sank into a chair and pressed the phone tight enough to warm my ear. She took a breath. "When I married into this family, I learned to make myself small to survive. I don't want that for you." Then she hung up, as if the truth were a bird she'd let loose and couldn't coax back. Long-buried secrets don't always come as confessions. Sometimes they arrive as context. The shape of Mark's silence changed that day from neglect to inheritance. It didn't absolve him, but it made the map clearer. The men in that circle had agreed explicitly or not that women were currency and quiet was safety. And my husband, who would never grab my arm on a dance floor, had learned to clap for the men who did. On Saturday, while Mark's team carpooled to the coast, I sent a carefully assembled package to 3 places at once, an outside law firm hired by the board, after a separate scandal forced their hand. Months earlier, a journalist whose work had taught me that truth can be patient and relentless at once, and HR with a copy to the company's general counsel, so the message couldn't be buried under process. The file included statements, dates, screenshots of calendars, photos of bar receipts submitted as client dinners, and a letter signed by multiple employees who had been waiting for a signal that they were not alone. I did not sign my name. I did not need to. At noon I dressed and went to the coastal hotel where their retreat was held, not to make a scene, but to watch a scene unfold. I stood across the street beneath a line of wind-gnarled pines and saw the first black sedan arrive. Then another. Men in suits, women with lanyards, a buzz of confusion in the salt air. Phones lit up like fireflies. Someone from legal walked in briskly, followed by the VP of HR with a folder hugged to her chest like a life vest. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady like a bell rung once and still sounding. Mark called me an hour later. I let it go to voicemail and listened to his voice say my name like it had weight again. He said he was coming home. He said there was an incident, that the retreat was postponed, that people were overreacting. Not even in crisis could he call things what they were. When he asked where I was, I told him the truth. Exactly where you left me. Then I hung up, and for the first time in months I didn't feel small. When Mark came home that night, his face was pale. The mask of a man who had built his life on a foundation suddenly shifting beneath him. He tossed his keys onto the counter, then stood there in the kitchen staring at me like I was supposed to read his mind. For once, I didn't fill the silence for him. I let it stretch until he finally spoke. "There was an investigation," he said, choosing each word like it might cut him. "Richard's been suspended. They're saying," he broke off, shaking his head, as if the accusations were too ridiculous to finish aloud. But I knew they weren't ridiculous. I knew they were true, because I had been part of the chorus that forced those words into the open. I sipped my tea calmly, my eyes on him but my heart steady. "And you?" I asked. My voice didn't waver. "What are they saying about you?" His jaw tightened. He told me his name hadn't been mentioned, that he was safe, but the word sounded hollow. Safe didn't mean innocent. Safe meant shielded for now. I wondered if he understood that silence can be its own kind of guilt, and that every person who had looked the other way was just as complicit as Richard. The days that followed were a blur of whispers, headlines, and late-night phone calls. Richard's name appeared in articles with words like misconduct and toxic culture. The company scrambled to contain the fire, but once smoke escapes, it's impossible to push it back inside. At home, Mark unraveled. He drank more. He picked fights over nothing. He asked me why I had seemed so calm when everything around us was chaos. I almost laughed at the irony. He thought calm was emptiness. He didn't realize calm could also be conviction. One night, as he sat on the couch with his tie loosened, he confessed something that chilled me more than Richard ever had. I knew, he whispered, staring into his glass. I always knew. I just thought it wasn't my place. There it was. The truth I had waited to hear and dreaded all at once. He had known. All those nights, he dismissed me as paranoid all the times he told me I was imagining things he had known. He chose comfort over courage. His loyalty was never to me or to the women hurt by Richard, but to the unspoken code of men protecting men. I felt the grief rise in me like a tide, but beneath it was something sharper clarity. I could forgive a mistake, maybe even one betrayal. But a lifetime of silence, of choosing complicity over integrity, that I could not forgive. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Mark's mother called me again, her voice trembling this time. "They're closing ranks," she said. "The board wants scapegoats. Some will lose their jobs, but the ones who matter most, they'll survive. They always do." Then she paused. "Unless someone makes sure they don't." Her words settled into me like a key sliding into a lock. I realized then that my quiet gathering of evidence hadn't been an act of desperation, it had been preparation. I already had enough to ensure Richard never touched another woman in that company. But Mark, his betrayal wasn't in the shadows, it was in the light he refused to shine. And now, I had the power to decide if his silence would finally have consequences. I thought about the years I had given him, the loyalty I had poured into a man who let me burn just to keep his own hands clean. I thought about the look on his face when Richard pulled me onto that dance floor. Not anger or jealousy, but amusement, as if my humiliation was a story for him to tell later. And I knew deep in my bones that I could not let him walk away untouched. So I began my second package. This one wasn't anonymous. It was signed, sealed, and addressed to the board of directors directly. In it, I detailed not only what I knew about Richard, but what I had learned about Mark. Emails, he ignored, meetings, he brushed off complaints, he redirected into silence. I showed them that complicity wasn't passive, it was active. It was a choice, and it had protected predators like Richard for years. When I pressed send, my hands didn't shake. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within days of sending that second package, Mark's world began to crumble in the same way Richard's had. At first, it was subtle: an emergency board meeting. He wasn't invited to a sudden cancellation of a major project he was supposed to lead. Then came the rumors whispered in corners of the office, but carried back to me by people who had once smiled politely at corporate events. Words like complicity, cover-up, negligence. Mark tried to brush it off, insisting it was politics, that he was being targeted unfairly. But the cracks widened. One evening he came home early, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and sank into a chair, his voice hoarse as he said, "They want me to resign." I looked at him, this man, who had once stood so tall in boardrooms and acted untouchable, and I felt nothing. Not pity, not rage, not even triumph, just emptiness. He had built his life on silence, and now that silence was devouring him. In the weeks that followed, he spiraled. Our conversations turned to accusations, him demanding if I had something to do with it, me refusing to answer. His paranoia grew because deep down he knew. He knew I had stopped being the woman who swallowed his excuses and started being the woman who saw him clearly. The night he finally broke was the night I decided to leave. He stood in the living room, pacing like a caged animal, shouting about loyalty, about betrayal, about how I had ruined everything he had worked for. And I thought about the irony that he was accusing me of the very thing he had done to me, to us, to every woman he had failed to protect. I packed my bags the next morning. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. I simply wrote him a note. "You lost me long before you lost your job. I hope someday you understand why." I left the key on the counter and walked away from the home we had once dreamed would save us. Starting over wasn't easy. I was 35, alone and carrying scars that didn't show on my skin, but lived in every hesitant step forward. But there was freedom in it too. Freedom in knowing I had chosen myself over silence. Freedom in knowing I had broken the cycle his family had passed down like an heirloom. Richard's name eventually became a cautionary tale in the industry, and Mark faded into obscurity, a footnote in articles about corporate culture reform. Sometimes I still hear whispers about him, how he moved to a smaller firm, how he struggles to find the respect he once commanded. But those whispers no longer have power over me, because I rebuilt. I found work that valued my voice. I surrounded myself with people who understood that respect isn't optional, it's the foundation of every connection worth keeping. And I learned that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about revelation. Sometimes it's about holding up a mirror and forcing someone to see who they really are. When I look back now, I don't see myself as the woman who was humiliated at a party. I see myself as the woman who refused to stay small, the woman who took betrayal and turned it into resolve, the woman who learned that silence can be broken and that when it is, the sound can shake entire empires. So if you're listening and you've ever felt erased, I want you to know this. You are not powerless. You are not invisible. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be quiet. If my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. And leave me a comment. Tell me, have you ever been forced into silence? And what did it cost you? I'd love to hear your voice.